Greetings from Microlab Northwest. We talked about ash. Today we'll continue our discussion of combustion particles produced by wildfire, and we'll consider char. Now, char is the incomplete combusted debris coming from the plants that are burned by the wildfire. These particles are created in a variety of ways. One of them is that as the particle chars, as the surface of a plant chars, there's a shrinkage that occurs. The material shrinks about 20% as it loses the hydrogen. Fire burns hydrogen first. So the hydrogen is removed, the carbon is compressed. The bonds between carbon to carbon increase. That's the coordination, carbon coordination number. It's higher. That has a couple of different effects. One is this shrinkage. The shrinkage can produce so much stress that these char particles literally pop off the surface of the charring plant. Another characteristic feature that occurs as a result of this charring is that with a higher carbon coordination number, the particle becomes more reflective. That's important, and again, a reason for episcopic illumination. Episcopic dark field illumination shows you the reflectivity of the particle. This reflectivity only occurs on exposure to elevated temperatures. It can be used in coal analysis to identify wildfire debris in the cold bed. For our purposes, it can distinguish easily between the charred plant material and black plant material that may be black just as a result of composting. It's important to be able to identify the char as distinct from other black material. When we're looking at char, the structures characteristic of that particular part of the plant are often retained in the char. We can actually see, like for instance here in Douglas fir, we can see the elliptical thickening that is characteristic of Douglas fir. The spacing, the regularity of the spacing, very characteristic of Douglas fir. That comes from the wood. We'll see why we might want to be able to identify the wood in some later videos. Some wood will be there, some charred wood. The dominant materials will actually be from the leaves and from the bark, as well as the ash that's part of the fire. Now, the char from the leaves quite often retains cell structure. The cell wall is thicker, and so it's going to have a darker appearance. The surface of the cell, because it's thinner, may still transmit light, be brown to black or gray. And we can identify that as charred material, again, by its reflectivity. But we need both transmitted light and reflected dark field. Reflected dark field shows us the reflectivity. Transmitted bright field often shows us structure that wouldn't be evident using reflected dark field. So again, multiple forms of light, multiple forms of illumination give us more information about the particle that we might be looking at. Now, leaf structure, if we're looking at a grass, for instance, that's charred, We're going to see a linear structure in the cells. We're going to see stomata, the breathing apparatus for the leaves. We're going to see the trichosomes, the hairs on the surface of the leaf. We're going to see the little circular shaped silica phytoliths that may be black in appearance because of deposited carbon that are the base of these leaves, the base of the fibers on these leaves. We're going to see the bark structure. Bark has a number of characteristic structures. Keep in mind that the purpose of the bark is to protect that thin layer just underneath the bark, which is the actual growing surface of a woody plant. The rings that are formed on a tree, for instance, show the annual growth. The annual growth occurs in this very thin layer just underneath the bark. The bark is trying to protect that thin layer. Bark, quite often, is kind of a foamy looking material when you look at it under the microscope. Bunch of little bubbles, interesting structures. Like you'll have what are called hub and spoke structures, where you have a circular pattern with arms coming out from it that attach to other circular structures. Some barks just look like foam when they're charred. Others show very irregular patterns. These are the lignin-rich areas that give the bark its stiffness, its strength. Now these bubbles in the bark, what they are actually doing is they're creating an insulating area, an area that protects this growing region from either high temperatures or low temperatures. It helps protect that thin layer. And all woody plants do that. The further north you go, or the further south, if you're in the southern region of this planet, the thicker the bark because of the more extreme temperatures. Bark has a very characteristic pattern, and we'll see here, looking at pine bark, charred pine bark, charred bark of Douglas fir, the charred bark of trees in the family Rosacea, like apple bark, plum bark, any of the fruit trees have this kind of structure in their bark. The characteristic patterns that we see in the char help us identify the variety of plants that are burning. If you're burning small branches in your fireplace that have bark on them, you're going to end up with a lot of ash because bark has a much higher ash content than the wood. But typically you're not going to be burning twigs from multiple different types of trees. You can characterize debris from a fireplace by the amount of charred wood. There'll be some charred bark, but it's all going to be pretty much from the same species of wood. We don't gather different types of wood to burn in our fireplace typically. And if we do, we burn one type. We're not going to be burning all kinds of different woody plants in a fireplace. So the debris you might get from a fireplace First of all, there's going to be a lot of charred wood because that's what you're trying to burn. There may be some bark, but it's all going to be from one kind of plant, and you're not going to have all the debris from the charred leaves. And a wildfire burns the leaves first. You're not going to have debris from charred grass. Grass burns very rapidly, doesn't produce a lot of energy. So it's not something you're going to be burning in your fireplace or your wood stove as a source of heat or of light. Charred grass is always part of a wildfire. When you look at a forest, you see grass growing on the ground level. In a grass fire, the main fuel is grass. Look at this example. This is a burned grassland. You can see that the woody plants that are here quite often still have their leaves. The fire moved so rapidly through the grass that it didn't even burn all of the leaves of these short shrubs, woody shrubs that grew in the same environment. It doesn't mean that a grass fire is safe. If the grass fire comes up to a home that's not protected, it will burn the home down. The char that we see has a number of different structures depending upon the types of wood that it's burning. Hardwoods, for instance, have characteristic vessel structures. They're easily identifiable as distinct from the gymnosperms, the softwood plants. The softwood plants have what are called cross-field pitting patterns, where the rays that come out from deeper in the wood cross the linear cells, the tracheid fibers of the wood. Where they cross, you get characteristic patterns in what are called the cross-field pits. Those can help you identify the species of the tree if necessary, or at least the family. So there are a number of different patterns. This cross-field pitting, for instance, in pine, is different than the cross-field pitting in Douglas fir. They're unique structures. And because of the fact that they're very lignin rich, they tend to char rather than to burn completely, and are stored as part of the plume. We'll look at a variety of different types of char over the series here on combustion products, but you've seen a number of them. The characteristic patterns in barks, characteristic patterns in needles and leaves, the characteristic patterns in grasses. They're all an important part of identifying wildfire. Identifying wildfire particles is more than just saying, I see black particles. There are all kinds of black particles. Wildfire produces a very characteristic set. And that's what we analyze when we're looking for wildfire debris. Well, that covers wildfire, char. Our next step is wildfire soot. And in that analysis, we'll see why soot is not a characteristic material for wildfire. We'll see what soot actually is and how it can tell you a lot about the combustion source that generated it. So long for now. As a postscript, we are making available a number of standard slides. We're looking at grasses, trees, bark, leaves that have been ashed, as well as some that have not been ashed, so that you can see the structure of these phytoliths prior to exposure to fire and then after exposure to fire. We'll also have some standard slides showing what these things look like when you pick them up off surfaces in a home that has been exposed to wildfire. With the right illumination, you can easily identify the wildfire debris among all of the other materials that were on the surfaces in those homes. So those are some things that we're offering along with the epi-illuminator. We'll have more of that in a later video. Thank you, and so long.